Hello, everyone, and welcome to this discussion about developing a podcast that resonates with your listener. My name is Caleb Hill, National Sales Director at Resonate Recordings. And first of all, I just wanted to thank Ever and the entire Outlier team for having us. Super excited to be on here. And it's amazing that he's been able to pull this together in light of the circumstances. And we're just super stoked to be on the show and be presenting to you guys today. And so we're really, the goal of this panel is to have an open and educational discussion geared towards both new and experienced podcasters. So just want to kind of have a raw, organic discussion about really all things related to podcasting, but specifically, what does it take to start a podcast and all the details around post-production and things like that, and just really try to answer a lot of questions almost from a basic developing a podcast that resonates with your listener. So the goal is to give podcasters like you an overview of what it takes to create a podcast that is well planned and that will be as successful as possible. So we will touch on the topics of content creation and production components that are required for successfully developing a podcast that will last. So I want to also introduce you guys. We've got Jacob Bozarth here and John Street joining us. Jacob is actually the founder of Resonate Recordings. He's our owner and president, and he founded it in 2014. Since founding and growing Resonate Recordings to be a leading podcast production company, Jacob has produced the hit podcast Culpable and done audio work on many well-known podcasts, including Up and Vanished, Sworn, and Atlanta Monster. Jacob has also earned a Bachelor's of Science in Recording from NTSU in 2011 and a Master of Arts as well. But his true, experience and education is in audio recording, and that's kind of what led him into this industry. Jacob, if you can kind of let us know, introduce yourself, but also kind of let us know what brought you into this industry, and ultimately how did you come to found Resonate Recordings?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. So as you mentioned, I went to school for audio in Nashville. My degree is actually a Bachelor of Science in Recording. Before going there to get that degree, I didn't even realize that existed. And coming out of school, I started listening to podcasts, and I realized that there were many shows that I actually really enjoyed that suffered for poor audio quality. And obviously, coming out of school, being an audio engineer, I was really in tune to focus in on the quality of the audio of things I listened to. So Resonate really started kind of out of a selfish desire of me wanting to help improve the quality of these shows that I listen to and help them sound better. So I actually reached out to a few hit podcasts that I listened to and actually was able to start editing, mixing and mastering for one show specifically that was a hit show. And we kind of negotiated an ad in his show at the end in the end credits, and shortly after that, his show actually helped solve an 11-year-old cold case, and so his 300,000 listeners grew very quickly overnight to over 1 million listeners per episode, and so we obviously had that ad in there, and that really kind of expedited the growth of Resonate, and from there it really took off.
Wow, and which show was that, Jacob?
Yeah, that was called Up and Vanished.
Okay. Wow, that's awesome. That's very cool. And with us today also is John Street. John is our operations manager. From a veteran perspective, he's our second longest employee here at Resonate Recordings, and next to Jacob, probably with the most experience here at Resonate. And so, John, I've only known you for about 6 or 7 months, but from what I know, you've come from a finance background. And obviously a pretty big shift in industries. Can you walk me through a little bit of your background and also how you got into the podcasting world?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I actually joined the Resonate team back in January of 2018. At the time, we were only a team of 4 people. As Jacob just kind of referenced, we were at that point in time really having an uptick in the number of clients we were working with and really starting to kind of put some stakes in the ground as far as figuring out how we would grow and scale the company with what we saw to be a lot of opportunity. So I did actually come from a finance background prior to this, worked for a large insurance company. Really enjoyed what I was doing there, but really I wanted to get into something that was a little bit more creative, get into a space with a company that I could get in on the ground floor with and really kind of ride the wave up as the company continued to grow. So it's been an amazing last 2.5 years for our team. Seen a lot of growth and a lot of opportunities, and it's been great.
Well, guys, the reality is that podcasting has become just a very, very powerful movement that is gaining traction. And I mean, the way I've seen it too is it's grown immensely, but I feel like it's continuing to grow. And I also feel like the industry as a whole is still trying to figure out, what it is as its own identity and what's going to happen with podcasting. But nobody can deny it's growing quickly and it's continuing to grow. But even on a webinar like this, I assume that the majority of people here are either actively podcasting or you're wanting to start a podcast because you realize the impact that podcasting can have. It's one of those things that I don't think you can deny it anymore. And I think almost everybody has at least heard the word podcast. And so you're really starting to see the effects that the industry is having. There's no doubt that podcasting is powerful and impactful. And the truth is that not all podcasts will be consistent or ultimately have long-term success. And I think that's one of the interesting dynamics of podcasts is why does one get 1 million downloads and why does one get 10 and why does one last for years and years and why does one last for a couple weeks? There's a lot of different dynamics in podcasting, and hopefully we can kind of dive through some of those here today. There's a lot of reasons for this, but we want to make sure that we provide everyone today with enough direction and help to know what it takes to make a successful podcast and how to have the best chance of succeeding as a podcaster. So we want to kind of hit this in sections. And the first section here is let's just start at phase one and step one. Let's talk about creating and planning, the creating and planning part of a podcast. So we would pretty much label this as pre-production and content. And this could be one of the most challenging things with podcasting is knowing where to begin, where to start. Maybe you have an idea in your head, but you're not sure how to get it down on paper and how to start talking into this microphone. So, John, you're actually a pretty creative guy, and so what encouragement would you give to somebody listening in right now on how to start the podcast, on how to start the process of creating a podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's something that we're often asked is, how do I start? Where do I begin? So the general encouragement that I would give somebody is that it starts with an idea, right? There are lots of ways you can take that idea. You can package it in a podcast, take that and run with it, but it all starts with knowing the why behind the podcast. So some questions that I would really start asking is, what goal is this podcast going to have? What impact do I think that it should have? What outcome do I hope that it's going to create? So starting with these gets the wheels spinning on knowing how to make a good podcast.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to add on that, just like John said, take that idea and run with it. I know for me, I have several active podcast ideas kind of flowing around in my head, and I like to go ahead and write those down. I write them down in like a journal or a notebook. Just so they can start kind of developing some legs. And so it may be a journal or a Google Doc or a whiteboard, but I would encourage you to write down that idea. And really, whenever you're ready, share it with someone that you know and trust well.
Awesome. Those are some good ideas. And I've only been in this industry about 7 months now, but I even find myself like, man, I think that'd be a great idea, or that'd be a great idea. And so just that simple tip of writing it down and taking that next simple step is pretty helpful. Guys, there's so many different types of podcasts out there. I mean, it's crazy the number of different categories and just all these podcasts. How does someone starting a podcast know where to start? Should they just try to mimic what other successful podcasts have done, or where do you even know how to start or where to start?
Yeah, I think really after you nail down the why, right, that idea of why for the podcast, I think you really have to start then thinking about the listeners. The truth is that nobody is going to know your potential audience better than you would know them. So if you already have a following, if you're already kind of a name who's got some people who are following after them, I would encourage you to think through the content and how it would be best packaged for those people who already know who you are. There's nothing wrong with copying other people, but I do think that one of the challenges with that is that we can start to compare ourselves to other people, right? Especially those podcasts that have been very successful. And then we feel like we're a failure if we have different results than they do. But I think the reality is that the most successful podcasts are really successful because, if we're being honest, they're riding on the coattails of greatness. So either the host is somebody who's well-known and they've got a following, or maybe they're a part of a podcasting network that's got a really broad and deep following, or maybe they're just really well marketed. Now, there will be some times where a podcast just happens to hit the market with the right message at the right time, and so they're going to have that good organic growth. But I think by and large, the reality is that you have to know who your listeners are, maybe start to take some ideas from some successful podcasts, but ultimately you need to make it your own.
That's good. That's good. So guys, we've worked with over 600 podcasts and helped with the creative process for many of them. A common question we're asked is about the style of podcast someone should make. John, how do you help people think through when they're saying that, like, hey, what style of podcast should I make? How do you help people think through that?
Yeah, that's a fair question, something we're asked pretty frequently. So the one thing that I would say is, I think that everybody can agree that podcasting really, at the end of the day, is a form of content creation. So whether you're telling a story narratively, or you're conducting an interview, or maybe you're just providing some sort of a monologue, you're crafting a message and developing content for other people to listen to and to consume. So if the goal in podcasting is creating content, then you really have to think through what the content is that you're creating, right? So I would say thinking about, hey, what's the driving factor for making your podcast? What's the message or the why that we just talked about? Who's the audience going to be that you're speaking to? What's the best format to engage with those people and get the message out? So I would say allow those questions to drive the style and the format. So don't always just duplicate what you've heard other people do if it's not going to be the right fit for you in your specific message and your podcast.
I think that's a great point. I'm really hitting on that originality, and the podcast was your idea. And so it's a lot of that's going to come from you and your mind and your creativity and your content. And sort of related to that, I get this question a lot. I'm on sales calls all day about people interested in podcasting. One of the most common questions I get is, how long should I make my podcast? And one of the things I've been telling people is, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. There's not a golden ticket to the perfect length your podcast should be. One of the things I've been telling people is, sit down and think through, what message are you trying to communicate to people, and how long is it going to take you to communicate that message? But John, I'm curious if you've had anything else to say about, because again, that's a really popular question. How long should my podcast be?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably one of the most common questions that we're asked. So yeah, to echo what you said, there's no necessarily right or wrong answer. We see some podcasts that are daily short sound bites that are 3 to 5 minutes. We see podcasts that are, long form, 1 to 2 hour podcasts. And then you're always going to have people like Joe Rogan who have 3-hour pieces of content that he's dropping. But the reality is, I think you just need to think through, when do most people listen to podcasts? So for myself, I listen to podcasts typically when I'm on my way to work. So during a commute, which is, 20 to 40 minutes usually. If I'm going to the gym or going on a run, so again, 20 to 30 minutes. So when you begin to put yourself into other people's shoes and you think about when they're going to be listening to your content, a really good rule of thumb is probably between 20 to 40 minutes, just because it gives them enough time to sit down, listen to the content, consume it in one sitting, and they don't have to remember to, I need to go back and finish that episode that I didn't get to finish the other day.
Yeah, that's good. So our team has had experience working on a lot of successful podcasts, but Culpable was the first project our team did from start to finish, which hit number 1 in Apple. What did it take for you to come up with an idea for a podcast that was intended from the beginning to have a big impact? Did you feel from the beginning that this was going to be a unique story?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Culpable was a unique story. It actually came to us and kind of fell in our lap. Ray, which was Christian's mother, which is who the podcast is about, and his death, came to us and actually asked, wanted to have us help do a podcast. And so The more we kind of dug into that, we realized that there was a really good story there, and we wanted to help her tell that story and get that story out to a larger audience that really the case never received. So we had actually already kind of vetted several show ideas and pitched them over to Tenderfoot TV, which is the production company behind Up and Vanish, which is the show that I originally started working with whenever I started Resonating. So they have a huge audience already, and so we definitely knew and wanted this show to have a big impact. And so for us, it kind of came down to like finding the right partners who are the players that we need to get this story out to find that. And so I think it's a really important part whenever you're starting a podcast to figure out who are the people you need involved, where your weak spots. For us, it was the audience. Like we didn't have the marketing and the audience piece. And so Tenderfoot played a vital role in helping that story have a big impact. And so that, we felt like it was a unique story. And then the audience that the Tenderfoot team has allowed us to let that have a huge impact, bigger than it would have been on our own.
Yeah, that's awesome. And guys, when you and the rest of the team were interviewing people for the show and creating the storyboard and developing the content, what did that process look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for us, it's unique. And I think one thing to keep in mind for everyone listening is that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer for creating a podcast. There's a lot of freedom in how you do it, how you go about doing it, what works for you, what doesn't work well for you. And so this is the way we did it. So we basically went out and did a lot of interviews and got a ton of content. We interviewed all the players, different family members, and pretty much anybody and everybody we could, private investigators, to really kind of have the full story and just get as much information as we could. And prior to that, we kind of had a rough outline or a rough storyboard that we had crafted as to what we wanted to include in the different episodes. But it was kind of very fluid until we actually got the interviews, because you really don't know what you have until you start recording. And so for us, from there, we kind of took the content we had and then figured out what's kind of the open and close, what's the climax of the episode, what's the main theme. And that was actually a team effort. Myself, Dennis, and Mark were the three main executive producers from our side. And so we really kind of set down many whiteboard sessions of where I would call kind of storyboarded out the entire season. And it changed a couple times throughout the season. I think that's one of the cool things about doing an investigative style podcast is it has to change, because you never know what you're going to get. If you're going to get a confession or if you're going to get something else or a lead that comes in, and you really have to be able to pivot quickly to share that new information.
Yeah. And with a project this large and just all the moving parts and this involved, what would you say was the biggest challenge you faced with Culpable?
Yeah, other than the many hours and late nights that we poured into it, I would say probably the biggest challenge was really having too many cooks in the kitchen at time, and really kind of not having clearly defined roles at times. I think that can create some challenges. And really knowing going into it, like, again, kind of who your team is, where are the weak spots, where are the voids that need to be filled, to really do a great show. And we knew that kind of somewhat going into it, but I think still just having so many different people, it made for an excellent podcast. Obviously I'm partial to it, but it sounds great. The story's great. The storytelling, kind of from beginning to end, it was our goal to make it as good as we possibly could. And we had pretty much all the, in my opinion, A players in the different roles that we could. Dirt Poor Robin scored it, which is a local musician here. And so, yeah, I think just having all those different pieces and all those different people, it presents some unique challenges of just moving things along, deadlines and stuff like that.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the music part, because that was actually one of my favorite. The way they scored that music just was perfect fit for the story of Culpable, which you kind of wonder like how would that happen, but that music was perfect for that show. So, well, guys, we have experience working on shows that have tens of millions of downloads and have climbed to number one, as well as shows that might have 100 listens per episode. And I think this is an important question, an important topic, because again, people at this webinar might just be starting out and trying to get 10 downloads, or there might be some people at this webinar that have gotten hundreds of thousands of downloads. Between those two different ranges of numbers and dynamics, what similarities do all podcasts have that other people may not see or may not know about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think really at the end of the day, based on our experience in working with so many podcasts and podcasters, I think the truth is that all podcasts are hard work and they're a labor of love. So it really doesn't matter if your podcast is just kind of a basic monologue or a basic interview style podcast, or whether it's a huge production, with a $250,000 budget for, 8 or 10 episodes. All podcasts are hard work, but my encouragement, in that would not be to scare people away from podcasting, but really to embrace it and understand how powerful of a platform it can be to get your message out, even despite it being a lot of hard work.
Yeah, that's good. Earlier in this discussion, we kind of talked about, what does it take to get started? And what if you have these kind of ideas flowing around in your mind and you're not sure how to really either pen those to paper or start talking in a microphone? Related to that, we actually just recently rolled out a new line of services centered around pre-production or the creation and planning part of podcasting. We're actually calling it producer services. Why did we do this, guys? What opportunities were there that the team felt needed to be filled in relation to this area of podcasting?
Yeah, this is something that we rolled out several months ago. For the first couple of years, about 2.5 years, our team really focused primarily on post-production, right? We became known as leaders in the industry because of our experience and our expertise, as you mentioned earlier, with just the training and the expertise that our engineers have. But one of the things that we were regularly being asked was, hey, can you help me with creating a podcast? Can you help me know how to plan my podcast? What style does it need to be? How do I plan out my season? How do I build my episodes? Some of these things that we've been talking through already. So we would kind of informally help people just because, we wanted to provide good customer care, but it wasn't really our bread and butter service. So really, we mostly encourage people to either self-study to be able to find out how to do those things themselves or find some sort of external producer that they could be able to work with. But really, there came a point where we started looking at the problem and we realized that there's a big gap in our industry with having experienced and accessible producers for a podcast that's not going to be a big, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollar type of a project. It's easy to find people who are willing to commit to that. But if you're just a normal podcaster who wants to create a really good, well thought out podcast, it's harder to find a producer to work with. So really, because of the experience that we have and the systems that we've built out, we've been able to create support for podcasters to help them think through how to create good content and then also handle their post-production so that they can stay right within the same ecosystem of Resonate Recordings, both for the content creation and then for the post-production.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, I know quite a few customers that have expressed gratitude for us bringing out this service because, again, they kind of had this idea, but they weren't sure how to translate that into a podcast. And so I think it's been a huge, huge help to people. So, well, guys, I want to talk about the process of recording a podcast, right? The kind of the nuts and bolts and the bread and butter really of what we do, and the microphones, the headphones, the softwares. And so just want to touch base, ask a couple questions relating to recording. Jacob, in your opinion, and you have an audio engineering degree background, for those of us who don't, or somebody getting ready to start a podcast, what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to recording a podcast?
That's a good question that I would say I'm asked often. I'm going to keep this short and actually just say the most important thing, in my opinion, is to know how to properly use your equipment. I know it's often said it's not the tools that you have, but it's knowing how to use the tools you have. And I think that's really important. Growing up, I played guitar and I always wanted to buy a new guitar because I thought it would make me better. But the crappy sounding guitar I had actually is what I needed to practice on to get better. And so it's not necessarily the tools. It's more so knowing how to use them. And so I think that includes You can do test recordings, mess with it, know it inside out, know the correct distance from your microphone, try recording in different environments, and really kind of play around with all the different tools and buttons and whatever else you have. There's a lot of great tutorials online that you can use and watch to know your equipment. We have a lot of resources on our website as well. So yeah, know how to properly use your equipment, I would say, is probably the most important thing when it comes to recording, in my opinion.
Awesome. So there are a lot of voices speaking to what good podcasting equipment is, right? All these, ads and industries and companies trying to say our equipment's the best, and the best way to record. But sometimes the information is conflicting or is more opinion than research, and how do you know if you're just getting blasted with Instagram ads because they're better at marketing and they don't really put out a good product, but they put out good marketing. So you as a trained audio engineer, you would know how to filter through that, and you've got years of experience in knowing this stuff. But again, for someone like me who doesn't have an audio engineering background, or somebody listening to this webinar, how do they filter through that, and how do they know what is what, and what should they spend a lot of money on, or what do they only need to spend $50 or $60 on?
Yeah, that's a great question. One I've wrestled with a lot as well. Well, I'll say, just to start out, I know there, like you said, there is a lot of opinions out there. And I think one thing to be cautious of is if you're reading someone who has their expertise is in more SEO and just ranking well in Google, be leery of their advice. I know I've reached out to several people in the podcasting space that rank really well in SEO and are at the top of all the searches in Google. And especially whenever they recommend a microphone that I believe sounds terrible and you should not waste your money on. And I've asked them, like, hey, why'd you choose that microphone? I'm just curious, from an audio engineering background, I've used that mic, and frankly, I think it sounds terrible. And their response was like, "Oh, actually, I just read stuff on it online, and I haven't actually even used it." And so, for me, that's a very poor thing to do, is to lead people to a microphone that you've never used and never have experience with. Also, I would say avoid advice that seems to make it more difficult than it should be. If someone tells you absolutely have to have a mixing board to record a podcast, run. And I would say don't listen to them and don't read anything else you see or watch anything else you see that they put out there. It's really our mission as to make podcasting easier, an easier way to podcast. And I think there are many great recording tools that are out there that are available that are very easy to use, at least to get started. I would say also you can test everything that you have. If you order something and you don't like it, return it for something else. Kind of, again, with microphones, there's not a one size fits all. With equipment, there's not a one size fits all. Your voice is unique. And so find a microphone that works well for you. Something that works well for someone else may not be the one that works the best for you. So I love Amazon for that reason, being able to, if I test something out, I don't like it, it doesn't fit well, I can return it and get something else that works better for me.
Yeah, and real quickly, just to add on to that, I think something else to keep in mind is finding people who will explain to you why something is good or why it's bad. Because I think one of the things that's really lacking, especially when it comes to podcasting equipment, is the technical perspective of why this microphone is appropriate or not appropriate. There's a lot of really great microphones that are good, but not specifically for the purposes of podcasting. And so people will recommend them, even though it's not an appropriate fit for this specific scenario. There's also people who will recommend, as Jacob said, popular microphones because they look really cool, but they're not an appropriate type of podcasting microphone.
Excuse me.
I didn't say that, though I agree. So one of the things that we really try and do as well in all of our resources is we try and do, comparisons and really get a little bit more into the technical side, but really for the purpose of helping people understand why this is a good microphone and why this is not a good microphone. And a lot of times we'll do, mic shootouts where we'll compare similar types of microphones, but across the spectrum so that people can hear the actual differences as well.
That's super helpful. So guys, with podcasting, one of the most appealing aspects of it is the cost entry to podcasting is so low, and really anybody can broadcast their voice for the world to hear, right? Their thoughts, their opinions, their ideas. But there could be this message that they're hearing that they have to buy really, really expensive equipment or it's not going to sound good. If somebody really wants to get into podcasting and they don't have thousands and thousands of dollars to invest in expensive equipment, what are some things that the average person could do that could really still help them have quality recordings and a good final podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll take this, and Jacob, you can add to it. So the first thing I would say is having proper mic technique. So knowing, as Jacob said, how to use the equipment well. So understanding your microphone, understanding how it works and how it functions, and then the proper technique to be able to use it. So as you'll see, we've all got pop filters here, which is one really simple thing that you can add that's going to help make sure that the quality of your recording is significantly better. The three of us right here, we all have microphones that are USB microphones that are under $100 each. So the recording quality of this could be better, right, if we had some higher level equipment, but it's honestly very good for what it is, even though we haven't invested a lot of money for these specific microphones. And then the other thing I would say too is, again, to plug our resources page, we've done a lot of study on different platforms across the spectrum to find out what works and what doesn't work. There are a lot of great resources out there that are either free or don't cost a lot of money that can still get you really good quality recordings. In fact, not that long ago, we also unrolled our own recording platform that people can use for recording content as well. So we've tested that against some of the others in the industry, and it's definitely held its own.
Yeah, just to add on that, I'll say, in addition to all those things, as John mentioned, proper mic technique, finding the right environment, a quiet environment, and also ensuring that your levels are at the correct level, that you're not clipping, that it's not too quiet. Those are three free things that you can do that really will go a long way when recording a podcast.
And then, guys, sort of related to what we're discussing now, what are some tips or strategies to keep in mind about the recording process that, again, will help that overall quality if you don't have an unlimited budget?
Yes, I'll take a first stab at that. So the short answer would be, as Jacob kind of inferred, just doing very simple things to make sure that you've got a proper recording environment. So if you've got devices, whether it's a computer or a phone, take 10 seconds to turn off those notifications. Find an area that's got a lot of soft and absorbent textures around you. So don't go to a dining room that's got a hardwood table and a tile floor. That's a big open room. There's going to be a lot of echo in that room. That's not going to be ideal for recording a podcast. Might be uncomfortable, but maybe go into a closet, right, that's got hanging clothes, or find a study that's got a big soft sofa with carpet and some big heavy curtains. Finding an area that's got a lot of soft surfaces that can absorb a lot of extra sound is really going to be your best friend when it comes to the recording process. And then not only do you need to turn off notifications on your phone or your computer, but then also just take a quick second to turn off your HVAC system. That will go a long way in making sure that the recording sounds as good as it can be.
That's good. Jacob, any thoughts on that?
No, that's all great advice. Reminds me, I think I forgot to turn off my HVAC for this recording, so I apologize if it's noisy in the background.
Yeah, but that's helpful because even those tips and tricks that people wouldn't know about, and I routinely forget about the HVAC system. And again, I think that all kind of leads back to that idea of, guys, you don't need a professional studio. You don't need thousands and thousands of dollars of equipment to let your voice be heard in a quality way. So that's awesome. Well, guys, lastly, I want to make sure that we talk about what happens after the recording stops. So really the post-production side of things. While having a good podcast idea and content is crucial and having a quality recording is really necessary to engage listeners, the process doesn't end there. The post-production process, where the narration, voiceover, interview, and all the pieces really come together with music and sound design, if it calls for it, to make a final episode to tell the story or get the message out. So there's a lot of moving pieces really in the post-production side of things. So a lot of podcasters try to cut corners when it comes to this area. The part of the process, because of the cost or just because they don't know how to do things that are needed, right? How important is the post-production process? And if somebody tries to skip that or really just DIY it through it, can ignoring post-production have a negative impact on the podcast?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, 100%. It can have a very negative impact on the listeners that you see and the numbers that you see and the people that will stick with it. So one thing to keep in mind that I'll say, I come from mainly a music audio engineering background, and I'll say all songs that you listen to on the radio, right? They've been professionally mixed and mastered. And there's a reason for this, right? There's kind of a standard that's there. And I think you're going to see that standard kind of increase in the podcasting space, even though there is a standard, but it's not like written or a rule necessarily. And I think the reality is you can have the best content in the world, but if your audio quality is poor, right, people will not listen, or they may turn it off, or they may quit listening, even if it is great content. I know there are many shows that I want to listen to because the content's interesting to me, but I frankly, I've just quit listening to them or stopped listening to them because they have poor audio quality. And so I think also another thing to keep in mind is with the increased numbers of podcasts and topics available, right? I'm going to say you're going to do yourself a disservice if your audio quality is not professionally mixed and mastered and not to the level of quality that the other shows out there are, because what's going to prevent your listener from just turning yours off because of poor audio quality and going and finding the next show that's out there. So if your audio quality is poor, I think, again, you're doing yourself a disservice, even if your content is the best in the world and you're the smartest person out there, the most experienced or most trained or most creative person. If your audio quality is poor, people aren't going to listen at the end of the day.
I think that's a very, very, probably one of the most important facets of podcasting is, and what I've been sharing with people too on kind of introductory to podcasting calls is, if you're going to command somebody's attention for 20, 30, 40 minutes, you're commanding their ears' attention, right? You're not necessarily commanding their eyes. And so whether it's houses or cars or paintings, that's all visual. And to use your analogy of, you can have the best content in the world. So you could have a Corvette engine inside, but if the Corvette is all banged up on the outside, nobody's going to want to buy it, right? And so if you're trying to command somebody's ears' attention for 30 minutes, you've got to entertain their ears as best as you can, not just from a content perspective, but from that audio quality perspective. And then I think that's partly why Resonate is growing so quickly and all these other podcasting platforms from a post-production side, because going back to what we were talking about earlier is even though the equipment doesn't have to be that expensive, the post-production side can be grueling. The editing process can be grueling, or even if you know how to do it, it could be extremely time consuming. And so I think services like ours and other services out there is where we really are helping people with kind of tackling that really difficult side of the post-production side. So another subject, a lot of people think that authenticity is most important in a message, especially when you're interviewing somebody. So editing can be seen as taken away from authenticity. So how important is it to have quality editing or any editing at all in a podcast? And related to that, I actually have people tell me that all the time, like, Caleb, I don't know if I want you guys editing my podcast because I want it real and I want it authentic and I want it organic. So how do you tackle that in regards to editing?
Yeah, again, so drawing on our experience with working with so many podcasters, the one thing I will say, though, is that a lot of people have speech patterns where they are very reliant on filler words, something that you don't really pick up on when you're actually just talking. But when you listen back to yourself or to your guest or whatever, there's going to be those filler words that are really just going to get under your skin. And so at that point in time, it's going to do you and your guest a favor to get that cleaned up, let alone, your listener as they're listening through the content. And so really at that point, you need to have a conversation about making sure that you have somebody who understands how to make an edit, but make a correct edit so that it's not choppy, that you're not, cutting breaths and, you have all these things left in that just make it unlistenable. So again, short answer is not everything has to be edited. I would say that most people do really want to have a nice, clean, professionally edited podcast. And so that's why they do use our services for that type of a scenario.
Yeah, one thing I'll add too that I share often with clients or prospects that are looking to work with us as far as explaining editing and how our team works and how we train our audio engineers to edit. is we really seek to maintain a level of authenticity even with the editing, right? So there may be times, like John said, where someone has a filler word every other word. I'm sure you've heard a lot of my throughout this webinar, and so even in that, right, there may be times where we leave those in if it's more distracting or feels less authentic to leave it in, right? To take it out, then we will leave it in by all means. So we really are striving to maintain a level of authenticity throughout the editing process.
And that's one of the unique things about our team is as we get to know new clients, we get to learn their preferences. We actually have a questionnaire that they can fill out so that they can say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, this is how tightly I want my content to be edited. I want you to still be able to leave some of that in. It's okay for me to trust you guys and trust your guts to know what needs to be left in and what's appropriate, or no, I literally want every filler word to be deleted out.
That's really helpful. Again, kind of reverting back to another topic we were addressing earlier, what are some tips and tricks on setting up your room, or should you go in your closet versus your dining room? So related to that, a lot of people have this mentality that, well, post-production is you can take things out and you can fix things that sounded bad, right? And so is there anything in post-production that can't be taken out? And, if so, what are some of the limitations of post-production process, and how can we set people up for success in regards to when they are doing this recording? What are things that can't truly be fixed in the post-production side of things?
That's a great question. Makes me think of something that several of my professors at MTSU in the audio department said over and over. Something they really drilled in my head, and it pardon me if it's a little bit vulgar, but they always said you can polish a turd all you want, but at the end of the day, it's still a turd, right? And so the point of that is if you record something that sounds terrible, no matter how much time you spend on post-production, it's still may sound terrible. And so we really do strive to help our clients record the highest quality by giving them the correct tools to record good quality audio so we can enhance the quality of it in the post-production process. And so I think that's one important thing is the post-production process is less about fixing issues and more about enhancing and supporting what's already there, right? We certainly do fix a lot of issues in post, but not everything. That's something that a lot of people fall into a danger is that, we can fix it in post. We can fix it in post. It's not always true, right? So I would say some things that can't be fixed in post. One thing particular would be like if your audio is really distorted, right? If it's clipping, there's not a ton we can do to restore that audio. We can, but it's a very time-consuming process and usually something that clients don't want to pay for. So that would be one thing. Another thing I would say is if the noise floor or the background noise is as loud as the actual dialogue, that's something to keep in mind. That it may be hard to we can still reduce that, right? But the level of minimizing it is somewhat limited as to what we can handle on that. So those would be two things to keep in mind. I think that's why the recording process is so important.
That's helpful. Very helpful. Well, guys, I kind of want to wrap it up here and really just end with kind of where we're at with the state of podcasting industry as a whole. And again, like I mentioned earlier in this talk, I think the industry is still sort of figuring itself out. But what opportunities, and I'm asking you guys both this, what opportunities do you see in the future of podcasting, or where do you see the industry going?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. I really wish I had a crystal ball to be able to give you the correct answer. But what my gut says is that even through everything that's been happening with COVID, and all the changes just across industries that are taking place, I think more and more people are coming to podcasting just to see how efficient and how powerful of a platform it can be for communication. So whether that's individuals, whether that's organizations, whether that's universities or nonprofits, I think everybody is beginning to see in a new light just how great of a platform podcasting can be to get their message out.
Awesome. Yeah, I know too. I'm getting a lot of calls lately with in light of COVID, everybody is switching to webinars and Zoom meetings and Zoom interviews, and daily I'm getting calls about hey, Caleb, we're already doing these recordings. Can we turn these into podcasts? And so I'm really curious myself. I mean, sooner or later, COVID's going to blow over and things will somewhat return to normal, but I'm curious what that new normal is in relation to digital media, streaming, podcasting. And so, excited for this to be along for the ride and very curious about the future. And so, guys, I just want to wrap it up by really saying there's no magic formula to making a podcast that will have impact and resonate with listeners, right? It's like John said earlier about having that crystal ball. It's just you can't put that, you don't know exactly, right? Until I think you just kind of dive into it and see what works and see what resonates with people's ears and what doesn't. There's a uniqueness to each creator, each podcast, and while there are things you can learn from others, ultimately, you have to catch the vision for your own podcast and be willing to do your own thing. Kind of like what John said earlier, it's your voice, it's your idea, and you're the only one of you out there in the world, right? And so nobody can truly mimic that 100%, and you can't mimic someone else 100%. And so be original, be creative. Present your story or your message in a way that you would like to hear it, that you think, would I want to sit down for 30 minutes and listen to my own story? I think that's a great question you should ask yourself as you're planning out your podcast. And be willing to push boundaries, guys. Be different. Make something unique that people would want to listen to. So, guys, that's it from the team here at Resonate. It was awesome being here. Ever again, thank you for having us, Outliers Conference. And guys, if you want to reach out to us and get in contact with us, resonaterecordings.com is our website. And then our social handles are at Resonate Record. And then our contact info will also be on the Outliers website as well. And then for general email inquiries, or if you want to set up an appointment to talk with us, hello@resonaterecordings.com. So guys, thanks again for your time. Thanks for giving us your ears and your eyes for the past 45 minutes, and look forward to talking to you in the future. Take care.